Welcome to Building the Future. I'm your host, Kevin Horick. You can check out the radio version of the show every Tuesdays and Thursdays at 2 p.m. Eastern on WDJY 99.1 in Atlanta. We also air on a podcasting network in Los Angeles called the 405 Media. There's a TV version of the show that airs on KMVT 15 in Silicon Valley at 8 p.m. Pacific on Tuesday nights. Both versions of the show air in other states. For these show times, plus past episodes, please visit the show's website at buildingthefutureshow.com. The music for the show is done by Electric Mantra. You can check him out at electricmantra.com. Join me at the 10th Annual Media Excellence Awards on January 18th in Beverly Hills, California. The attendees and I will be celebrating innovation and leadership in technology and entertainment. There are 20 award categories with 1,000 nominees. These awards honor those who are creating groundbreaking technology to better our lives and celebrate the hard work, determination, and brilliance in the leadership within the companies which create the new world we live in today. I will be recording nominees and winners at the awards. For tickets and more information, go to MediaXAwards.com. Welcome back to the show. Today we have Dylan Ruga. He's a trial lawyer at Stalwart Law Group. Dylan, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Kevin. Glad to be here.
Yeah, I'm excited to have you on the show. I think what you do is actually kind of really interesting, and kind of my audience can really kind of benefit from getting kind of your advice and thoughts and kind of your experience. You've done a lot of really cool things, and kind of helped a lot of people kind of on the legal front of things. And I just working at a startup myself, I very much understand how important having kind of legal when you need it, or even when you don't need it, is very important. So I appreciate you taking the time out of your day to be on the show. But maybe before we kind of get into what you kind of do day to day, let's get to know you a little bit better and start off with where you grew up.
Sure. Yeah, I grew up in San Francisco. Went to school. High school and elementary school in San Francisco, and then left to go to a small liberal arts college in Ohio called Oberlin College.
Okay.
And I went there. Strangely enough, I was recruited to play baseball there, so I started off playing baseball and then wound up playing some football as well, and really kind of enjoyed being at a smaller school out in the Midwest. And then when I graduated, I moved down to Los Angeles, I thought, just to go to law school. So I went to law school down in L.A. and started at Loyola Law School, where I went for my first year, and then transferred over to UCLA, where I finished. And then following law school, I stayed in L.A., and I've been here since.
Okay, so what made you want to go into law? Was there kind of like a defining moment growing up, or how did you kind of get into it?
I wish I can say that there was a specific moment in my life where I kind of had the epiphany that I wanted to be a lawyer, maybe because I saw some grave injustice or something. It just didn't happen that way for me. It was something that I've known that I've wanted to do since as far back as I can remember, and I really don't know why that is. It just always was that way. And ever since I was, before high school, people would ask me what I want to be, and I'd say a lawyer, and it's just been that way.
No, that's cool, man. Like I love those kind of stories where you just kind of fall in love with something for some reason in your childhood, and you just kind of go for it, and you become that. I think that's great. So walk me through, you graduate university, you've worked at a bunch of kind of firms. Walk us through kind of your journey up into the company you're at now.
Sure. So following law school, I worked with a federal court judge for a year as his clerk, and kind of gained really valuable insights from being on the other side of the bench and seeing kind of what goes on behind the scenes from a judge's perspective. So after doing that for a year, I went into private practice, and I was at a mid-sized firm for a year, and then it disbanded, and I went to a large international firm where I was just kind of a junior associate starting off in my career. And worked my way up the ranks and made partner a few years ago. And that's always kind of the dream as an associate at a big firm, is to make partner. And so
Sure.
I got there. I got there and was partner for a few years, and then realized that it just wasn't for me.
Okay. So walk me through how you got to Stalwart and kind of what you do there.
Sure. So I decided after realizing that I really didn't enjoy being a partner at a big firm, I decided to resign my partnership and kind of hang up a shingle. And so I was fortunate that I was able to do that. A lot of people, get used to big firm salaries, especially once you make partner. You can live a very comfortable life, and so it's difficult to kind of walk away from that. But
Sure.
I really had two things going for me that allowed me to make that jump. And the first is that my wife also is a lawyer, and she also is a partner at a big firm, and so she provided that type of stability for me.
That's great.
And secondly, it's wonderful. And secondly, I had some clients who were very loyal and who, I knew would support me during the first year of the firm.
Sure. So walk me through exactly kind of what Stalwart Law Group kind of does on a day-to-day basis, because you guys do stuff in a bunch of different kind of legal verticals, but walk us through kind of generally what you do, and then we'll kind of get into more specifically what you do.
Yeah, sure. So we do only litigation work.
Okay.
Which means that, we don't do any type of transactional work, which means kind of putting together agreements or doing deals. We only get involved when people are, suing other people or in some type of dispute. And so the type of litigation that we do varies. I do mostly general commercial litigation, which is anything from partnership disputes to breaches of contract to any type of business disputes. I also do a fair amount of IP litigation and counseling, and some legal malpractice work. Other people in my firm do employment litigation and personal injury litigation, and that's really about it. We don't do any type of family law or tax-related issues or things kind of outside of what I've just described.
Sure. So walk me through kind of a typical, probably week or month for you. Like, what types of stuff kind of come across your desk and are you kind of working on, right? Because I think as kind of a trial lawyer, sometimes it's got to be like really, really kind of exciting, and you're probably working on some really interesting stuff.
Every day is different, that's for sure. Right now, I'm working on a case that's going to bring me out to Hong Kong and Asia in a few weeks. So that's pretty interesting.
Sure.
The case itself involves some furniture that was manufactured for a pretty well-known celebrity here in the States, and that celebrity created a furniture line and hired my client to help manufacture that furniture. And when the furniture was delivered, they were not pleased with what they got. And so the dispute is whether the furniture came back as ordered or whether it wasn't. And in representing my client, I have to take depositions and defend depositions, and some of the people with knowledge are located out in Hong Kong and in China, where I'll be going in just a few weeks to take care of that. So that's one case I'm working on right now. And another case that's taken up a bunch of my time is an appeal of a trademark-related case that we won here in the trial court and federal court about a year or two ago on behalf of a startup, and we won the case, and now the other side is appealing it to the Ninth Circuit, which is the appellate court, and we are working on the Ninth Circuit brief to kind of defend our victory.
Sure. No, that's great. So I'm curious then, because you guys, obviously, you just mentioned with the furniture company that you guys kind of obviously do stuff cross countries and cross ocean kind of stuff. How does that kind of work? Because I've heard kind of the horror story side of that, and I'm sure people have too, where it can be really tricky to kind of get justice when somebody either rips you off or doesn't deliver what they say on, especially when it's in a totally different country. Like, how do you guys kind of handle that?
Yeah, so particularly when you're talking about intellectual property laws, they vary pretty widely in different countries. Asia, in particular China, has been known for a long time to kind of be the wild west, so to speak, in terms of IP protection, in the sense that there really has been no meaningful protection in China for a long time. But that is it's actually getting better. And the Chinese government is beginning to take notice and stop kind of the more flagrant infringement practices that have been going on out there. But the reality is, it's always better to try to enforce your IP here in the States rather than going abroad and trying to enforce it under other countries' laws.
Got you. Okay. So how does it kind of work? Because the thing that I think a lot of people struggle with, especially if they're a startup or in technology, maybe they're making some money, but they're not like super wealthy yet or whatnot, and something happens where they need somebody like yourself. Like, at what point do you bring on somebody like yourself, or what things can you kind of start to do maybe before they bring on somebody like yourself?
Yeah, well, it's kind of like you mentioned at the beginning. You never kind of want a lawyer until you need one.
Sure.
And so it's important to have people that you know and trust who can help you out at the beginning. In relation to startups, it's really important to speak with a transactional lawyer, which is, again, not something that we do, but something that startups should do in order to properly form the startup from the beginning and get the company a solid foundation. And once you have that relationship with a transactional attorney who can kind of help you through that process, if and when you get into any type of dispute, that lawyer should be able to refer you over to a litigator like myself. That being said, we also work a lot with startups on the IP side.
Okay.
And we understand that startups don't really have a lot of cash to burn on legal. And so we have just recently kind of launched a product at our firm where we are offering essentially an alternative to trademark insurance, where startups can come to the firm and talk to us about the trademarks that they are considering using, and we will take a look at what they're doing, and then in exchange for some amount of equity up front, meaning at this point, we will help you obtain your trademark registrations and get you through that process. And then if the startup is ever sued for trademark infringement, we will defend these startups and not charge any legal fees.
Oh, interesting.
So we'll basically, we'll absorb the risk of that type of litigation.
Sure. So what kind of startups do you guys kind of look for if somebody's looking to, because they're basically pitching you, fair?
Yeah, sure. I mean, we talk to a lot of them.
Okay.
And it just depends what they're looking for. I mean, look, on the IP side, when trademarks are really important for startups for a whole host of reasons, but
sure.
A lot of startups will pick a name that they think describes their product pretty well, and from a marketing perspective, that may be a good idea because kind of brings to mind what your product is, and kind of helps people when you don't have any brand recognition kind of identify what it is that you're selling or providing. But from a trademark perspective, a descriptive name or mark like that usually doesn't give very much protection, and so we can kind of work with the startups to counsel them in the right direction of how to get a bit more trademark protection. The other side of it is startups that we see oftentimes rush to pick a name without really taking the time to see if it's available. And sure. What happens is that they invest a lot of time and money in building up the brand and the goodwill, and they spend a lot of money purchasing maybe a URL to acquire their website, and And they do all this, and then 6, 12, 18 months later, they get a cease and desist letter from another company that they've never heard of, but that claims rights in their trademark. And then at that point, the company needs to decide whether to fight that claim and start investing a bunch of money in litigation, or whether just to, drop the name and pick a new one. And that can be pretty difficult if you've already invested a lot in the name that you chose.
Sure. So do you look for kind of more software-based, hardware-software-based, or is it, because I guess why I asked that is because software, I think, is kind of hard to trademark. Is that kind of fair to say?
I'm not so sure it is. I think
Okay.
that, it depends what type of software it is you're offering, right? Like, obviously, the big software platforms that you think of, Adobe and Microsoft and things like that.
Yeah.
All of that software is trademarked, all of those names and brands.
Sure.
So we really don't discriminate in terms of what type of startups we're working with. Well, all we're looking for is startups that are serious about what they're doing and really want to make sure that they are smart about their trademark selection up front.
Sure. So is there, though, there's got to be some startups or maybe industries that people work in that are probably have a higher chance of potentially needing your services at some point. And so how do you kind of decide, like, you know what, guys, I don't know if it really makes sense to work together because I don't think you'll ever need us, or, oh, it very much maybe makes sense to work with you guys or like us because you probably will have some sort of issues down the road kind of in the legal front. Is that, do you guys kind of work through that with kind of people that are coming in to say, like, hey, we might need you guys? Like, how do you guys kind of balance that?
So it's not so much what type of product or service that the startup is working on, as much as it is how far along in the process they are, right? So a startup where you just kind of have two friends getting together, with an idea, and they want to start a company. If they came to us, I'd probably say, guys, you're smart to think about these things, but maybe it's a little bit too early. Why don't you kind of get further along before you really come talk to us, and before it makes sense for us to help you out. On the other hand, the startups that typically run into problems are the startups that get venture capital and funding from some source. And once they kind of get that funding and that funding becomes public, it's amazing how quickly people come out of the woodwork and claim prior rights in the names and things like that. So it's really kind of the startups that have made it far enough along that they have some funding or backup from investors that are going to really start to need our services more than others.
I got you. Okay, so what is the process kind of like if I have something that somebody claims that it was theirs or they own part of it? What is the kind of the process? Like, I get it's probably different for kind of depending on what it is, but is there kind of a general process of how this kind of works? Just because I'm kind of curious to know, just if anybody's kind of going through this or going to go through this in the future, kind of what can they kind of expect from the whole process of kind of somebody makes a claim saying, you're using my name and I've owned it for a decade or whatever. Like, how does that kind of work? What's the process around that?
Well, each case is different, and
Sure.
So I'll start by saying that. But I mean, generally, we will, if we're on the receiving end of a letter like that, we will obviously investigate the claims and see if there's any merit to it. And so one way to do that is to look into this plaintiff's allegations and see if they really had been using the mark for as long as they say that they've been using the mark. And then if they have, then you look for other defenses that you may have. So you may be able to argue that their mark is invalid for a variety of reasons, and some of those reasons may be because their mark is generic, or their mark is descriptive, and we don't believe that they can show something called secondary meaning, which is a fancy word for meaning that nobody in the public associates that mark with that particular company or producer. And so there are other kind of legal defenses that we will explore, and then we'll consult with the client and let them know that this is a problem. You've got to do something about it or not. And if it's a problem, then the ways to address it are again, either by changing the name or by getting involved in litigation, or maybe there's a compromise solution where you can reach a licensing deal or agree that, for example, you can continue using the name of the company in exchange for either a license fee or some sort of equity in the company.
Sure. No, that makes a lot of sense. So we've covered a lot of kind of technology and startups, but you have done stuff in kind of a bunch of other fields. You kind of mentioned furniture, but what other kind of industries have you kind of done cases or like working in, if you have the option to work in those verticals?
So over the years, I've really done a lot of real estate disputes. Done a lot of partnership disputes. Where,
Okay.
And partnership disputes tend to get pretty messy because being in a partnership with somebody is kind of like being in a marriage, and when those things go south, there's a lot of emotions involved, and partnership agreements aren't always as clear as they should be, and so there's just a lot of finger pointing, and those cases just get pretty messy. So we've done a lot of those, which I enjoy. Done a fair amount of entertainment-related work, and
Okay.
working with some of the better-known celebrities and talent out here in Los Angeles, and that type of work is it's interesting because you're dealing with people that you read about in the press, but
Sure.
the reality is that the legal issues are the same, and sometimes dealing with talent and their team isn't as easy as dealing with, for example, a sophisticated corporate client.
Yeah, fair enough, I suppose, right? And I don't mean it mean, but like, if you're, I don't know, like a movie star or something, you might not be the most business savvy, right? Like, just because that's not what you went to school with, that's not what you do, right? So I could see that. That makes sense.
Yeah, it's not just about not being business savvy,
Okay.
which is part of it. It's also, largely, number one, being used to getting what you want, and having people around you that
Sure.
tend to say yes a lot. And sometimes as a lawyer, you need to be the person in the room that says no to the client, and to have those type of difficult discussions that movie stars aren't used to having. And there's also a problem of just being busy. I mean, sometimes it's pretty difficult to just have the type of contact with those type of clients, whereas kind of the more traditional, sophisticated corporate clients are pretty easy to reach.
Yeah, sure. And I guess because like people are traveling a bunch and whatnot. So do you guys, I know you also have an office in New York, correct?
We do, yeah.
So you guys kind of do mostly stuff in kind of New York and California. I know you're doing some stuff overseas right away, but like, do you guys kind of try to focus in those geographical regions, or do you kind of do stuff across the states and kind of beyond, or where do you guys kind of like to work?
Yeah, I mean, I'd say, look, the vast majority of our cases today are in California and New York.
New York,
We do
okay.
have, we do have some cases in other parts of the country. I can think of a case we're handling at the moment in North Dakota, and another one in New Jersey. And so there are some in other parts of the country, but we have boots on the ground in California and New York, and so that's where the majority of our business happens to land.
Sure, and especially I guess if you're doing a lot of technology stuff, like you're kind of in the heart of it between kind of San Francisco and LA. Like I get that there's other parts in the country, but you can't really argue that like between Silicon Valley and I know like they call it like Silicon Beach and kind of Santa Monica, Venice area, that like you guys are basically in the heart of kind of the technology kind of state, right? not saying New York isn't,
Yeah.
but they're probably in the top 2 or 3. There's a handful of really good startup scenes kind of across America, but just kind of for the listener to understand kind of where you traditionally kind of practice, I think makes a lot of sense. So I'm curious though to dive into a little bit other kind of typical cases that you maybe enjoy doing or kind of stuff that you've dived into. I think we've talked some kind of IP and trademarky stuff and kind of some furniture stuff, but how much kind of maybe like hardware or I know just when I was doing a little bit of research for the show, you've done kind of some stuff around photography and fabric designs and stuff like that. Walk me through kind of some of the other types of litigation work and kind of trial stuff that you've done in the past that you guys kind of have done, just so people understand kind of exactly what you guys bring to the table.
Sure. So the examples you just mentioned, photography and fabric designs, those are both copyright-related cases, and
Okay.
and the photography case was a really interesting case where we represented a photographer who was hired by a shoe company
Okay.
to do some shoots that and take some photos that were going to be used as part of a marketing campaign for the shoe company. And so when that happened, there's a license agreement that's entered into between the shoe company and the photographer. And the license agreement says that the shoe company can use these photos for, a few months in the United States, and they pay the photographer for those uses. And what turned up happening is that the shoe company went well beyond the terms of the license agreement. And
Gotcha.
The way that it was discovered is that the photographer was, on vacation in Europe somewhere and noticed his photos, on a billboard or two, and then started scratching his head and came to us and really didn't know what was going on other than there were a couple photos that were being used that shouldn't be used. And through the litigation process, we discovered that, it was beyond anybody's kind of imagination, the extent of this, and thousands of uses for many years, well beyond the terms of the license. And that was an interesting case because, the photographer, wound up being able to sue for copyright infringement and breach of the license agreement. And the shoe company, their defense was, yeah, look, we made a mistake, but you agreed when we hired you that for the license term that you agreed to, you charged us only X, and so yeah, we went beyond that. So maybe we should pay you 2 times X or 3 times X, and we were able to basically get a lot more money for the photographer than he otherwise would have been entitled to, and so that was a very kind of fulfilling case for us.
Sure.
But we also handle a lot of employment litigation also on the plaintiff side, and employment litigation I also think is pretty awesome because you're representing people who have been either discriminated against or harassed at work, and particularly today with all these allegations coming to light about sexual harassment and other things. It's really an interesting area to practice in because times are changing and social norms are changing, and what may have been acceptable 5 years ago no longer is acceptable in the workplace and just generally in society. And so the law is kind of slowly shifting to take those type of things into account. And so it's a very interesting area to practice in, especially today.
No, that makes a lot of sense, right? I think that's fascinating. So you kind of mentioned it quickly earlier. You've done some stuff in kind of the real estate space. Walk us through maybe like an example or two of kind of what happened there and kind of how you guys handled that.
Sure. So I can give you a couple cases I'm working on right now.
Okay.
One of them, we represent a landlord who owns some commercial property here in Los Angeles, and their tenant was a kind of a well-known pizza franchise. And that tenant was there for a number of years and then fell behind in the rent for a significant amount of money, somewhere in the six figures.
Oh, wow.
And rather than paying the rent and making good on its obligation, the franchise basically shut down and literally moved across the street to another building and began operating once again across the street. And so, we were kind of brought in that sense to kind of recover the money that was owed from the franchise, but also we were able to make claims against the franchisor and argue that they were kind of complicit in the scheme to abandon our client's property and go across the street. And that was challenging, but also, got a great result there. So that's one type of commercial, real estate dispute. Another one we're working on is, where we represent a client that owns some apartment buildings here in LA, and they wanted to sell the buildings, and about a year ago entered into an agreement to sell them for a price, and the buyer then came back and tried to renegotiate the price after they had a deal, and our client said, well, no, we're not going to do that, the deal's off. And for whatever reason, that was never communicated to the buyer, and since prices in real estate have continued to climb, the buyer comes back 6 months later and says, you need to sell me the property. The contract was never terminated. And so we are now, fighting that fight and going to litigate the issue of whether the contract was properly terminated or not. So those are just two examples of kind of what comes up in the real estate context for us.
Sure. So I'm curious then. So the pizza joint, is that case kind of not necessarily easy, but like it's pretty cut and dry, right? Like they clearly, like at least in my opinion, and for just kind of from what you said, like it sounds like they obviously knew what they were doing, right? So is that case like a lot easier to kind of argue and kind of like, do they even really have a ground to kind of stand on in that sense? Because it's like clearly if you didn't pay and you moved across the street, like you're probably in the wrong. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, although they made it a little bit more complicated because the pizza joint, when they were in our client's property, was owned by a husband, and then when they went across the street, they opened the franchise under the wife's name.
Oh, okay.
And then they claimed that the husband has no money and the wife doesn't have to pay for the husband's obligations.
Right.
And so there was a little bit of a shell game going on that it required us to uncover.
Sure, but then I would assume that the apartment building that you mentioned after that, like that's got to be kind of a quite intensive to kind of prove that, right, and figure that out. Like that's got to be a more complicated case. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, well, it's complicated in that what makes that case in particular complicated is that the agent was representing both the buyer and the seller in that case, right? And so our client tells the agent, I'm done with the deal, and the agent, for whatever reason, maybe because he wanted his commissions on the sale, never communicated to the buyer that the deal was done. And so it creates that type of wrinkle. And so each of these cases kind of has its own unique facts and makes it difficult. The ones that are kind of open and shut, slam dunk cases tend to resolve pretty quickly, and it's pretty easy to see the writing on the wall.
Sure.
It's the ones in the gray area that that get litigated.
But I also think that those are probably more fun, especially when you believe that your client is in the right? Like if it has to drag out is the wrong word, but if it has to go on for kind of months, but your client's right, especially maybe in the photographer's case, right? Like that's got to be kind of fun from just kind of your side to work on something like that where you're like, it's clear that this happened, we can prove it, and you feel good about, obviously helping the photographer in this case. get his money and what he's rightfully owed. Like, that's got to be kind of really fulfilling for you, because that would be for me at least.
Yeah, no, it is. It is really fulfilling, especially to work with an individual and kind of help an individual, right a wrong, no matter what context. So whether it's
Sure.
a photographer who's been burned, or whether it's somebody in the workplace who's been discriminated against, or whether it's any context, it is really fulfilling to kind of work with individuals. So. Yeah, I mean, I think the answer to that is yes, and there's also the question of litigating on the plaintiff side generally versus on the defense side, and we do both plaintiff work and defense work, and on either side, it's interesting because each case really is essentially you're an investigator and you're investigating the facts, and we like to kind of develop a strategy at the beginning of each case and kind of imagine a chessboard and thinking 2 or 3 moves ahead and where we need to end up and how we're going to get there, and putting those strategies into place is what makes it interesting for us.
Sure. So how much of your kind of year would you say is actually kind of in court? Is it maybe like a quarter of the time? Is it half the time? How much are you actually kind of like in court, kind of either, kind of arguing for the defense or for kind of the, or for either side, I guess?
So trial work happens largely not in the trial room.
Okay.
And so, the trial itself, is the culmination usually of, a couple of years worth of work on a case.
Okay.
And so, we handle a few trials a year, and each trial can take, a couple weeks or more of actually being in the courtroom. And then, before you get to trial, you are in court dealing with, motions that are brought up, or discovery disputes, or, pretrial issues that happen to arise. But I'd say, actually being in the courtroom during the year, I don't know, maybe 10 to 20% of our years actually spent in the courtroom.
Sure.
And the rest of it is doing what we do, either, meeting with clients or taking depositions or writing briefs or researching the law, or, doing what needs to be done in order to position the case for trial.
Sure. So how often is kind of some of the stuff kind of changing? Because especially kind of on the technology front, like obviously it's years ago now, but kind of that like famous Apple Samsung case where, Apple was suing Samsung because they thought they ripped off their phone, and whether whoever side you're on doesn't really matter. But like, how often is kind of technology kind of changing the law, or is the law still kind of pretty far behind, or a bit of both, or kind of what's your thoughts on that?
I think that, obviously technology is always changing, and the law does a pretty good job of adapting to kind of meet today's current needs, but it does lag behind. And
Sure.
so that's the lag is what provides opportunities for people to kind of push the envelope and, kind of see what they can and can't get away with. And, examples of this kind of happen, recently in the television and cable space, where you have new technologies that are trying to get people away from traditional wired cable boxes and allow people to view content wherever they want,
Sure.
however they want, without necessarily paying for it. And so those type of issues come up, and there's not always a clear answer under the law whether that's allowed or not, and that's what creates new law, and that's kind of how the process goes, and so that the law is always, I think, a step or two behind the technology, but it's a symbiotic relationship in the sense that they kind of keep pushing each other to grow, and that's what causes the evolution.
No, I think that's great, and I was just kind of curious to get your thoughts on that, because obviously it's got to be behind because stuff's getting kind of pushed forward. But I was curious to know how fast they try to catch up, and that's interesting. So we're kind of coming to the end of the show, and I know you're going to be at the Media X Awards kind of in January there. What exactly is your involvement with that? And have you kind of been to the event before? Because it's the 10th year, as I understand it.
Yeah, no, this is the 10th year, and you know what? It's my first year, and I'm really excited to be there. And I've been asked to be one of the judges for the awards, and
Very
so
cool.
you know, yeah, it's really exciting, and I've heard a lot of great things about the awards, and so I'm excited to participate.
Sure. So what are you judging? Do you have certain categories you're judging, or you're kind of judging across all of them, or how does that kind of work?
Yeah, I've been assigned particular categories to judge, and you know, I'm not sure how much of the judging process I can disclose, but
sure.
I've been assigned a few of the categories and have reviewed the submissions, and I'm looking forward to you know, meeting the people responsible for creating the technology and for, you know, participating in the awards and kind of seeing the other side of it.
No, I think that's really great. So let's maybe close the show with mentioning where people can get more information about yourself and the firm, and where they can kind of check you guys out in LA or New York.
Yeah, sure. So our website is www.stalwartlaw.com. It's STALWART law.com. And in LA, we're in Westwood here, not far from the UCLA campus.
Nice.
And in New York, we're right in Union Square area, so kind of by NYU and Washington Square.
That's very cool.
Always happy to hear from people, and Kevin, I appreciate your time.
Yeah, I really appreciate you taking the time out of your busy day to be on the show, and I look forward to keeping in touch with you and seeing you at the Media Awards in January.
I'll see you there.
All right. Thanks, man. Have a good day. Bye.
You too.
Thanks for listening. Please visit the show's website at buildingthefutureshow.com. Also check us out on Facebook at Building the Future Show and follow us on Twitter at Building Show. The music for the show is done by Electric Mantra. You can check him out at electricmantra.com and keep building the future.